The Christian Bible is made up of two testaments, the Old and the New. The Old Testament, or Hebrew Bible, is the sacred scripture of the Jews, and recounts in 39 books in poetry, prophecy, story, and song the history of a people from the creation of the world. Its profoundly theological understanding of all creation as proceeding from one God is, for both Christians and Jews, the ground of their faith. The New Testament, which complements, or, as some would say, fulfills the Old, is a compendium of 27 books in Greek, which represent the testimony of those who witnessed and sustained the ministry of Christ. The Old Testament is commonly divided into three parts: the Law, or Torah, sometimes called the Pentateuch, made up of the first 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy; the prophets, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets; and the writings, Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Each part arose as a separate collection of sacred texts, with the law in use as scripture by 400 BC, the prophets by 200 BC, and the writings by about 130 BC. Through all the ravages of war and persecution, Hebrew scribes had labored to preserve copies of the texts intact. But it was not until after the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, which completed the diaspora and scattered Jews from the Pillars of Hercules to the shores of the Euxine Sea, that Jewish scholars in Palestine established as canonical the Old Testament in its current form. Well before that, however, in the wake of the stupendous conquests of Alexander the Great, which made Greek the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Hebrew Scriptures had been translated into Greek by elite Jewish scholars in Alexandria, Egypt, to serve the Greek-speaking Jewish communities of the Hellenistic world. Legend has it that in the 3rd century BC, 72 such chosen scholars, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, were dispatched by the high priest in Jerusalem to Alexandria at the request of King Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who wanted to include in his great library there a copy of the Torah in Greek. The scholars were royally received by the king and then set to work in a quiet house on the island of Pharos, where they completed their translation in exactly 72 days. The remaining books of the Old Testament, as well as some 14 others, called the Apocrypha and used by Jews outside Palestine, were also translated in subsequent years, and the whole became known as the Septuagint, meaning 70, after the round number of translators who had originally taken part. The Septuagint was the Bible of the first apostles, and was afterward adopted as scripture by the early Christian Church. But the more Christians embraced it as their own, and used it in polemics against Jews, the more Jewish scholars felt constrained to repudiate it as an imperfect translation and to enumerate its flaws. At just this time, in the 2nd century AD, the New Testament also began to take shape as a collection of sacred texts. The story of the Passion and the actual words of Jesus had originally been preserved by oral tradition, and it was from that tradition that the disciples had taught. St. Paul's letters to various churches in the Roman provinces were apparently the first New Testament texts to be accepted as inspired, but it was not until the middle of the 4th century AD that the 27 books as we know them were established as canonical. These are the 13 epistles of Paul, the 3 synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Gospel according to John, the epistles of James, Peter, John, and Jude, the Acts of the Apostles, written by Luke, and Revelation, written by John. Meanwhile, the Roman Empire had supplanted the empire of Alexander the Great and imposed its language and culture on Christian communities throughout its vast domains. These adopted Latin for their ceremonies and rites, and in the 2nd century AD, an Old Latin translation of the Bible, made directly from the Greek by persons unknown, came into use as scripture by the Latin-speaking churches of North Africa.